The summer of 1932 should have been a season of hope, but in the heart of America's capital, the streets would soon run with smoke, confusion, and betrayal. They came by the thousands, fathers, husbands, war heroes, men who had once marched through foreign battlefields under the stars and stripes, braving machine guns and mustard gas for the sake of freedom. They didn't come to Washington, D.C. for glory this time. They came with their families, carrying little more than worn uniforms, faded photographs, and the last threads of dignity the Great Depression hadn't yet stolen from them. Their mission was peaceful, to ask for the money they had been promised years earlier, a bonus for their service in World War I. Money that could mean the difference between food and hunger, shelter and the streets. But what they found waiting for them was not compassion. In a shocking twist, the very government they had fought to defend saw them not as heroes, but as a threat. And on a sweltering July day, the United States would do the unthinkable, unleashing tanks, bayonets, and tear gas, not on enemy soil, but against its own veterans. This is the story America tried to erase. The day a nation turned on its own heroes. When the guns of World War I fell silent in 1918, America's soldiers returned home as victors, hailed in parades, cheered by crowds, promised a grateful nation's eternal thanks. For many, those parades ended with a handshake, a smile, and little else. In 1924, Congress passed the Adjusted Compensation Act, offering veterans a bonus for their service. But there was a catch. The payment would not arrive until 1945, more than 2 decades after the war's end. The government called it a fair compromise. The veterans called it a delayed debt. At first, the delay barely mattered. The 1920s roared with prosperity. Jobs were plentiful, and the future seemed bright. But then came the Great Depression. Factories closed. Banks collapsed. Men who had once charged enemy lines now stood in breadlines. For many veterans, the unpaid bonus became more than just money. It was survival. It meant a meal for their children, coal for the winter, rent for the month. It was a promise made by their country, and in desperate times, promises become lifelines. They wrote letters to Congress, organized meetings, and pleaded for early payment. But Washington turned a deaf ear. Politicians feared the cost, warning of budget ruin. To the veterans, it felt like betrayal. And so, a quiet determination began to spread through veterans' halls and smoky backrooms across America. If the government would not come to them, they would go to the government, in numbers too large to ignore. It began as whispers in veteran halls, a bold idea, almost reckless in the eyes of some. If Washington won't come to us, we'll go to Washington. Not as scattered voices, but as an army. A new kind of army. In the spring of 1932, they set out from every corner of the country. Some trudged along dusty back roads, boots worn thin from years of hardship. Others clung to the sides of freight trains, risking life and limb to save the cost of a ticket. Entire families squeezed into rusted Model Ts, engines coughing on every mile toward the capital. They called themselves the Bonus Expeditionary Force, a name that echoed the American Expeditionary Force that had once stormed the fields of France. But this time, their mission was not to capture enemy trenches. It was to claim a promise. By June, Washington was transformed. More than 20,000 veterans and their loved ones filled the city, spilling into empty buildings, abandoned lots, and the floodplains of the Anacostia River. There, they built a sprawling shantytown from scrap wood, canvas, and anything they could scavenge. It was not chaos, it was order. Streets were named. Rules were posted. Patrols kept the peace. Every night, campfires flickered against the backdrop of the Capitol dome, as men in tattered uniforms swapped war stories and shared scraps of bread. From a distance, the scene might have seemed almost noble, the nation's forgotten soldiers united in their cause. But behind closed doors, Washington's power brokers saw something different. Not patriots, but a growing mob. Not a plea for justice, but the makings of unrest. The veterans thought their presence alone would compel Congress to act. Instead, their march was sowing the seeds of a confrontation that would soon explode in the most shocking way imaginable. For weeks, the veterans held their ground in Washington, confident that persistence would force lawmakers to honor their word. Each day, small delegations marched to Capitol Hill, uniforms patched and boots scuffed, to plead their case directly to senators and representatives. They spoke not of charity, but of debt, a debt paid in blood on the battlefields of Europe. The House of Representatives listened. On June 15, 1932, they passed a bill to authorize early payment of the bonus. Cheers erupted in the camps. For the first time in years, hope surged like a rising tide. But just 2 days later, the Senate delivered a crushing blow, rejecting the bill by a wide margin. The dream was dead, at least for now. Many veterans, broken and disheartened, packed what little they had and began the long journey home. But thousands refused to leave. They had risked everything to get to Washington, and they would not be driven out by political indifference. Inside the White House, President Herbert Hoover grew increasingly uneasy. To him, the encampments were more than a nuisance. They were a symbol of disorder in a city already struggling under the weight of the Depression. His advisers whispered of communist agitators hidden among the veterans, stirring unrest. The press fueled rumors of violence, painting the bonus army as a powder keg ready to explode. In truth, the camps were remarkably peaceful. But in the eyes of Washington's elite, peace was irrelevant. The longer the veterans stayed, the more they embarrassed the administration and inflamed public sympathy. Something, Hoover decided, had to be done. What the veterans didn't know was that the order to remove them was no longer a question of if, only when. And when it came, it would not be delivered by police or marshals, but by the very army they had once served. The morning of July 28, 1932, began like so many others for the veterans, humid, restless, and heavy with uncertainty. In the camps, men lined up for thin coffee and stale bread. Children played between shacks of scrap wood and tar paper. No one knew that within hours, their community would be wiped from the map. It started with a spark, a confrontation between veterans and Washington police near the Capitol. Shouts turned into shoves. Shoves turned into gunshots. 2 veterans fell, bleeding into the summer dust. Word rippled through the camps. Someone had been killed. President Hoover, already under pressure to restore order, seized the moment. The call went out, not for more police, but for the United States Army. To lead the operation, Hoover chose General Douglas MacArthur, a man with a flair for the dramatic and little patience for restraint. At his side was a young Major Dwight D. Eisenhower, watching history unfold in grim silence. By mid-afternoon, Washington's streets shook with the rumble of tanks, actual tanks, rolling toward unarmed veterans. Cavalry units, sabers gleaming, fanned out across Pennsylvania Avenue. Infantry advanced with bayonets fixed, gas masks strapped to their faces. Tear gas canisters hissed, filling the air with choking clouds that burned the eyes and lungs. Mothers clutched children as they fled. Men in threadbare uniforms, the same ones they had worn in France, were driven back at bayonet point. Fires broke out as the soldiers pushed into the Anacostia camp. Before nightfall, the shanty town was engulfed in flames, the sky lit orange over the Capitol dome. When it was over, nothing remained but smoldering debris and the bitter taste of betrayal. The veterans had faced artillery before, but never like this, never from their own flag. The government called it necessary. The veterans called it something else entirely, the day America declared war on its heroes. When the smoke cleared over Washington, the nation awoke to headlines that seemed almost impossible. U.S. Army drives out veterans. Photographs splashed across newspapers showed tanks in the streets, soldiers in gas masks, and war heroes fleeing under a hail of tear gas. Children with streaming eyes clung to coughing mothers. Charred timbers jutted from the ashes of what had once been a proud but humble community. Public reaction was swift and furious. For many Americans, the bonus army had been a symbol of dignity in desperation, men who had asked for nothing but what they were owed. Now those same men were branded as dangerous radicals and forced from the Capitol like criminals. President Hoover insisted the eviction had been necessary to protect the city from insurrection. His allies spoke of hidden communist influences and the need for firm action. But to ordinary citizens, those justifications rang hollow. The reality was burned into the public's mind. America had turned its guns inward. The tragedy reverberated far beyond the ruins of the Anacostia camp. It hardened public opinion against Hoover, painting him as cold and detached from the suffering of everyday people. Many historians believe this single event helped seal his fate in the upcoming election, paving the way for Franklin D. Roosevelt's sweeping victory later that year. For the veterans, the consequences were even more personal and more permanent. They returned to lives already racked by poverty, now with the added weight of humiliation. Some would never recover, disappearing into the shadows of the Depression. Others carried their bitterness for decades, convinced that the country they had fought for no longer cared for them. The irony was cruel. Just 4 years later, in 1936, Congress voted to release the long-delayed bonus. For many of the men who had stood in Washington that sweltering summer, the money finally arrived, but the scars, both physical and moral, could never be paid off. In the years that followed, the bonus army faded quietly from the nation's collective memory, not because the event lacked significance, but because it was inconvenient to remember. It was far easier to celebrate America's victories abroad than to confront the shame of turning weapons on its own veterans at home. Textbooks devoted a few passing lines, if they mentioned it at all. Politicians rarely spoke of it. Photographs yellowed in archives, buried under decades of dust. For a new generation, the idea that U.S. tanks once rolled against unarmed war heroes seemed almost unthinkable, something that happened in other countries, not here. Yet for those who had been there, the memories never dulled. The acrid sting of tear gas, the thundering clatter of tank treads on city streets, the sound of a child crying in the chaos, these were not just scenes from the past. They were wounds that never fully healed. The bonus army had marched for justice, not revolution. They had asked for dignity, not charity. But in the eyes of the powerful, their persistence became defiance, and their defiance became a threat. And so, their story was quietly filed away, locked in the drawer of history's uncomfortable truths. Today, few Americans can name the day when their country attacked its own war heroes. Fewer still can explain why it happened. But history's silence does not erase its lesson, that a nation is judged not only by how it fights its wars, but by how it treats those who fought them. The veterans of 1932 may have been erased from the official narrative, but their march still echoes in the conscience of anyone willing to listen. It asks a question that should never stop being asked. If it happened once, could it happen again? The flames that consumed the bonus army's shantytown in 1932 did not burn away their cause. If anything, they lit a slow, smoldering fire in the nation's conscience. Though the veterans had been driven out, their march had left deep footprints that future generations of soldiers would follow. In the months after the eviction, letters poured into newspapers from citizens outraged by the government's actions. Some called it a disgrace, others a national tragedy. Politicians who had supported the assault felt the sting at the ballot box. And quietly, within Washington's power circles, a lesson began to take root. A government that ignores its veterans courts political disaster. When the world plunged into war again in 1939, this lesson loomed in the background. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who had opposed the early bonus payment in 1932, tread more carefully when dealing with World War II veterans. His administration knew the cost of another public betrayal could be catastrophic. By 1944, as millions of soldiers prepared to return home from the battlefields of Europe and the Pacific, Congress passed the GI Bill, a sweeping promise of education, housing, and opportunity. Though hailed as a visionary policy, some historians quietly note its shadowed inspiration, the memory of the bonus army. The GI Bill was, in many ways, an unspoken attempt to ensure that no future president would face a march of desperate veterans at the Capitol steps. Still, the echoes of 1932 would not fade. In the 1960s and 70s, Vietnam veterans marched on Washington to demand fair treatment, many carrying signs that read, "We are the new bonus army." Gulf War veterans and Iraq War veterans would later do the same, staging protests over medical care, disability benefits, and housing. The spirit of the bonus army, that willingness to stand together against neglect, lived on in each of them. It was as though the ghosts of 1932 walked alongside them, whispering a warning. Never let them forget what they did to us. For years, the official version of the bonus army eviction stood unchallenged, a tidy narrative crafted by the Hoover administration and echoed in press reports of the day. The veterans were painted as unruly agitators, infiltrated by radicals, their camps a breeding ground for trouble. The army, we were told, acted only to restore order. It was a story designed to be neat, forgettable, and above all, unquestioned. But history has a way of whispering to those who listen. Decades later, historians, journalists, and surviving witnesses began piecing together a different truth, one far more unsettling. Buried in military archives were field reports from soldiers ordered to clear the camps. Many described the veterans as calm, organized, and largely peaceful. One account, long hidden from public view, told of families being given mere minutes to flee before the soldiers advanced. Belongings, uniforms, photographs, letters from the front were left behind to be trampled or burned. Even more damning were the memos and correspondence unearthed by investigative journalists. They revealed that Hoover's top advisors had deliberately exaggerated claims of communist infiltration in the camps, knowing such accusations would frighten the public and justify drastic action. Intelligence from the FBI's own files suggested that radical influence among the veterans was minimal, yet the specter of an uprising was the perfect political cover. Eyewitness interviews with surviving veterans painted an image of chaos and betrayal. Cavalry charging into crowds that included women, children, gas canisters rolling into tents where infants slept, tanks crushing makeshift shelters. Several veterans swore that soldiers ignored pleas to retrieve keepsakes before setting fires, as if the destruction was not collateral damage, but the point. The deeper researchers dug, the more the official story unraveled. What emerged was not a necessary operation to restore peace, but a calculated decision to send a message that no matter who you were or what sacrifices you had made, challenging the government in its own backyard could come at a devastating price. For decades, this truth lay buried under layers of political spin and public amnesia. But like smoke seeping through cracks, it found its way back into the light. And with it came an uncomfortable realization. The erasure of history is not an accident. It is an act. The bonus army's story is a haunting reminder of how easily a nation can turn on its own heroes and how quickly such truths can be buried. For decades, this event was erased from history books, but silence only helps it happen again. By remembering, we honor their courage and warn future generations. If this story moved you, share it so others can learn the truth. Comment your thoughts. Should this be taught in every classroom? And subscribe for more Untold history. Together, we can make sure their voices echo through time, not fade into silence.